Good evening. So thank you so much to all of you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us. It truly does speak about the commitment of our community to better understand the world around us, one historical tangent at a time. During a time when maybe our social and moral fabric seems tenuous and on the verge of fraying, it is this type of intellectual dialogue and introspective reflection on our history that gives us hope. Hope to see a clash of values and consequent polarization to turn not into paralysis, but into an awakening. It is most certainly hopeful to see our youth come together with the understanding that though progress is not linear, though it is not guaranteed, it is possible. I'd like to especially thank Mr. Vallada, our Model United Nations team, who just won Best Large School Delegation at the CCWA Fall Conference. Mr. Chalice and Mr. Calderon for making tonight possible. So for those of you who have had the privilege of a lifetime to be Mr. Perse's students or colleagues, know that no introduction can encapsulate his larger-than-life personality and commitment to service above self. As a history teacher for 38 years, Mr. Perse not only taught his students about the world, but taught his students to learn about themselves and to find their place in the world. Understanding history, as he explained on the first day of class, can be analogized to creating a jigsaw puzzle, requiring us to zoom in and out between the big picture and the details that compose it, often within the same moment. Mr. Perse teaches history in a way not merely focused on the what, but also cognizant of the how, which inherently influences the what. In exploring the nuances of contemporary reality and our past, its juxtapositions and its contradictions, with a balance of objectivity and compassion for humanity, as you will see today, Mr. Perse is undoubtedly an eminent thought leader in our community. As a historian and former naval analyst during the Cold War, Mr. Perse embodies the civic responsibilities we must hold as we inherit and inhabit our nation's rich and humbling history, starting with the effort to understand it. As activist Marge Perse once said, "I love people who harness themselves an ox to a heavy cart, who pull like water buffalo with massive patience, who strain in the mud and muck to move things forward, who do what has to be done again and again." We love Mr. Perse for his incredible patience to teach us, to prepare the posterity for what is yet to come, and ultimately to make each of us here today better human beings. He continues to embrace these values as a football coach for Case Western, a history tutor, and an integral writer, researcher, and historian for the nonprofit organization Teaching Cleveland. So without further ado, we'll have Mr. Perse come up, but make sure that you have a pen and paper and start writing. So let's welcome him with a round of applause. Thank you, everyone.
After that, you can only be disappointed moving forward. But thank you very much for being here. I'm truly honored to have this opportunity to speak to you, and I wish everyone a happy, joyous Thanksgiving. Warfare in the 20th and 21st centuries, and I'm going to ask a question about it. Is warfare obsolete? And clearly, when we look at it from one perspective, the answer is no. Considering ongoing conflicts in the world today, Ukraine, the Middle East, Korean Peninsula, and elsewhere. And I think these different forces, countries, organizations that engage in warfare do so for a reason. In other words, to fulfill certain objectives. They find value in using force and violence. So even though the answer to this question is clearly no, in one sense, My hope tonight is that I can give you some rays of hope. I'm not going to be able to answer that question completely. I'm not going to maybe be able to answer it in a satisfactory way, but I hope that I can give you some rays of hope amidst these dark clouds. It starts with a basic proposition from Karl von Clausewitz, who was a Prussian general during the time of Napoleon. He fought against Napoleon at times. He fought with Napoleon. And his famous book on war is still taught in colleges and universities today. And his basic proposition is war is nothing but the continuation of policy with other means. In other words, warfare is a method that different sides use to achieve their goals. And I'm going to try to present it in a way that maybe when they consider their goals, warfare isn't always the best answer. It'll take a few minutes to get to that point. But it is a method that has been used throughout all of time, and it involves one side attempting to impose their will on the other, and the other side resisting that. All of you should be familiar with that in terms of a teacher assigning homework. The teacher says, you will do your homework. You resist that. You say, no, I won't. And thus, we have a conflict. In that sense, conflicts are not self-starting. In other words, there is this back and forth imposition of the will and resistance to that imposition. If one side said to the other, you will do what I tell you to do, and the other side says, okay, there's no conflict. But life isn't so simple. And we get to that point where the implications of this, one side says, this is what I want. Oh, I'm sorry, we lost our, there we go. One side says, this is what I want, the other, and I'm willing to pay this price. The other side says, this is what I want, and I'm willing to pay the price. It comes down to making a cost-benefit analysis. So I can hopefully help you with Model United Nations. Whatever committee you're on, you're going to have a certain position. Define what that position is and what you're willing to do to achieve that goal. Well, that's what nations have been doing since the beginning of time. Again, it involves a hostile intention. This is what I want, I'm willing to pay. In other words, both sides are acting in what they perceive to be their own best interest. And it involves a type of reciprocity. And all of you are familiar with that definition, and I'll be coming back to that point a number of times here this evening. It is a reciprocal arrangement. Again, one side says to the other, you will do what I tell you to do. The other side says, no, I won't. And therein is the basis of a conflict. And what we've talked about here so far is both sides have a willingness to engage in conflict. But there's still a missing piece, and that is the ability to engage. Having the willingness to engage in a conflict is meaningless unless there is a corresponding ability. And this is where there might be a ray of hope where perhaps warfare might be seen as obsolete. We all know that everyone has problems with a lot of other people. I mean, countries have problems with countries, organizations. But when you get to the ability, this is where it gets dangerous. And given the abilities of the weaponry today, the destructive nature of the weapons, we can now pose the question, is warfare obsolete? Does warfare even fit into a rational cost-benefit analysis, understanding the type of weapons we have, weapons of mass destruction? Can this reciprocity ever get out of hand? And I'm going to explain in a couple of minutes that the answer is yes. And if that reciprocity gets out of hand, we can then ask the question, is war worth it? Again, given the ability that nations have and the destructive capabilities that they all now attain. Again, herein lies the ray of hope. So back to the original question. Is warfare in the 20th and 21st centuries obsolete? And when we look at war, we've seen three distinct trends during these centuries. Total war, as represented by American experiences in World War I, World War II. Limited war, represented by American experiences in Vietnam, Soviet experiences in Afghanistan, perhaps even currently Russian experiences in Ukraine. And unfortunately, over the last 50 years, terrorism has now become a form of warfare. But for me, even though we can identify these three trends, and even though tonight the focus is more on total war, it is a relative term. A small group of people who are fighting for something they believe in, using everything at their disposal, for them, that's total. And I think when we look at the specific outcomes of conflict, characterized by the intensity, the duration, and the results of conflict, we can see that it is not always a mutually accepted definition of what total war means. I can guarantee you that when the United States first entered the conflict in Vietnam, they never anticipated the intensity, the duration, or the results of that conflict. I can guarantee you that the leadership in Russia today did not contemplate that their aggressiveness in Ukraine would go on this long, be this intense, and have the results it has. So again, this definition of total war is very, very relative, but it involves one thing. And again, this is where I might start to provide a bit of a ray of hope. And it's going to sound ironic at first, but it always involves some type of escalation. And my hope is, and I hope the leaders of the world begin to realize this, with the prospect of escalation, maybe we don't want to go there. So back to Clausewitz again, and he explained the results of escalation by coming up with three reciprocal actions. The first one is one we're already familiar with. One side dictates to the other will resist. So right from the beginning, we have a conflict. There is hostile intention. One side says to the other, you will submit to my will. The other side says, no, I won't. And we have kind of a stalemate in aggression, which leads directly to the second reciprocal action. As long as my enemy is not defeated, he may defeat me. As long as the outcome is in doubt, the war will continue. So what started off as perhaps an analysis that the conflict would be short in duration, now we have the potential for it to escalate. And because there is still no breaking of the stalemate yet, it leads directly to the third reciprocal action, Clausewitz's fancy words, the sum of the available means and the strength of the will. And all that's saying is, if I've used X amount of force to get my way and it hasn't worked, I now have to use X plus amount of force. If I use force at a low level and I can't get what I want, I'm going to intensify the use of force to a higher level. And what it gets down to is a kind of kill or be killed, win or lose, succeed or fail mentality. And when that type of reciprocity kicks in, there is going to be, as Clausewitz termed it, a push to the extreme. Now, obviously, we don't want that to happen in warfare, but it is precisely this that could be my ray of hope. If leaders understand that there can be this push to the extreme, perhaps, maybe, there'll be second thoughts. I hope that to be the case. A more precise definition, and I think in language that we can understand a little bit better, was provided by an analyst named Hans Morgenthau, who was a leading international relations specialist in the 20th century. And he talked about 5 characteristics of total war. A war of the population, that is, the entire population participating in the effort, by the total population, those folks that actually go off to war, against the other side's total population, using everything they've got, point number 4, total mechanization, and a war for total stakes. And if one side embarks on this journey, incorporating all 5 of these points, what is the other side to do if they don't want to lose, but having to mimic that? And when one side engages in these 5 characteristics, and the other side feels compelled to engage in these characteristics, we get a push to the extreme. And again, ironically enough, it is this push to the extreme that is my ray of hope. And of course, this automatically incorporates the willingness to engage, point number 5, you're fighting for everything you believe in, and the ability to engage, points 1 through 4, using everything you've got. So these are basic philosophical definitions of total war and how things can get out of hand. Let's take a look at these in an actual historical context. World War I. I'm not going to go through all of these statistics, but in 4 years of World War I, it is estimated that the total casualties were approaching 2% of the global population. 2%. And I know 2% doesn't sound like a lot, but when you consider that the world population at the time was 960 million people, 2% adds up. One particular battle during World War I was the Battle of the Somme, taking place in France from August or July until November of 1916. At the end of that battle, almost 500,000 British soldiers had died, over 200,000 French soldiers, and again, almost 500,000 German soldiers, and the battle went on for 4 months. Many historians, most historians, believe that nothing was accomplished by this battle. It did not fundamentally change the nature of the war, and so ideally the question comes up is, was this worth it? How could this have fit into any rational cost-benefit analysis? The benefit was negligible, the cost astronomical. Gil Elliot, a Scottish philosopher, referred to this kind of devastation as areas of the dead. It wasn't just confined to a battlefield, but World War I created whole areas of the dead. Unfortunately, many of those involved in World War I did not quite grasp just how bad things were until after the war. My ray of hope is that leaders today might grasp that before we start the process. But continuing the context, we move to World War II. Death as a total percentage of the population almost doubled, from just under 2% in World War I to now just under 4% in World War II. And just like World War I, there was a particular specific example. World War II offers several. The Battle of Leningrad lasted 872 days. 1.5 million people were killed. Auschwitz, at some points killing 12,000 a day. If you extrapolate that out to the 872 days of Leningrad, that's 10.5 million people. Hiroshima, 80,000 instantly. And based on the weaponry, our ability to use these weapons, perhaps the world will begin to realize just how easy it is to kill, and maybe that's not something we really want to do. Again, I know it's a tenuous ray of hope, but a ray of hope nonetheless. But in any event, World War II escalated, there's that word again, escalated from areas of the dead to what Gil Elliott referred to as whole nations of the dead. Is it really worth it? Many analysts have looked at this escalation of violence, particularly with the advent of technology, automation, those kinds of things, and have used what is called the machine analogy to describe warfare in the 20th and 21st centuries. Well, war, like any other machine, has a software to it. That is the willingness to engage and the hardware. So we're right back to where we started. And when we look at the characteristics of any machine, it starts off in a very positive thing. A machine is to perform a task repetitively, untiringly, unrelentingly. That's good. Yet when we apply that analogy, that machine concept to warfare, we start to go down a bad road. It begins to take on a life of its own. It becomes very impersonal, very dehumanizing. I mean, just think of the casualties in World War I and World War II. So overwhelming, we couldn't even identify who these people were. Very indiscriminate and disproportionate. And that gets into perhaps the ray of hope. Why would we engage in something that ultimately is going to destroy what it is we're trying to protect? It becomes immoral. No distinction made between combatants and non-combatants. Given the weapons technology, the damage, the destruction, the death is not confined to the battlefield. And thus, hopefully, irrational. Why would we engage in an activity which will culminate in the destruction of the very thing we are trying to protect? What's the point? I do have a personal analogy to all of this. When I was in college, I was living in an apartment with some friends. Needless to say, we didn't keep good house. It was kind of sloppy, dirty, crumbs all over the place. And we realized that we had bugs in the cabinets where we kept the food. And we certainly did not want the bugs to get into the food. And we felt that if we sprayed, the bugs would just go to the apartment next door. The people next door would spray, the bugs would come back. So we had to come up with a way to destroy our enemy, the bugs, and to protect our food, our very survival. And one evening, we decided we were going to put firecrackers in the cabinets. Not just any firecrackers, M80s. And that was one heck of an explosion. And I'm sure we killed a lot of bugs. And in the process, we destroyed the cabinets and all the food therein. I wish we had learned that lesson. I wish we had done a cost-benefit analysis prior to engaging in that behavior. So we can apply these lessons to our everyday life, and hopefully we as individuals make good choices. But in any event, as we continue through the 20th and 21st century, nuclear war. Let's escalate a little bit more. And a recent Princeton study has estimated that over 34 million people would die in the first couple of hours and perhaps another 57 million injured. Just looking at those numbers, what could be worth it? It just doesn't make any sense to me. And this is where Gil Elliott escalates his comment from areas of the dead to nations of the dead to a world of the dead. What could be worth that? As Oppenheimer himself said in witnessing the first atomic explosion at Los Alamos, now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. And I don't think it was just hyperbole. When we look at the destructive power of nuclear weapons, I'm not going to do all the arithmetic for you, but basically using non-nuclear weapons, if you want to deliver 1 ton of destructive power, you have to drop 1 ton of dynamite on your target. It's a 1-to-1 ratio. Nuclear weapons, we start to up it a little bit, measured in kilo and megatons. 1 kiloton is equal to 1,000 tons of destructive power. A megaton is 1,000,000 tons. Think of some of the images of Hiroshima, and I don't mean to minimize it, that was only 15 kilotons, which was the equivalent of 30 million pounds of dynamite. Weapons have been tested upwards of 60 megatons. One B-52 bomber in the American force carries the equivalent of 25 megatons. So again, think about what 15 kilotons did to one city in Japan in World War II. You can't even fathom it. Oh, and by the way, the United States had 263 B-52s, each one carrying 25 megatons of destructive power. I'm hoping this works and we can see the effects. I know that many of you might be a Cleveland sports fan. Perhaps, maybe. Let's do Pittsburgh. And since we really, would you let me blow up Pittsburgh, please? Since we really don't like Pittsburgh, let's use the biggest bomb ever tested, 50 megatons. Well, let me get back to, I'm sorry, let me go back to this. I got to get to Pittsburgh. I lost Pittsburgh. All right, but let's, Detroit. Oh, here we are. Let's go to Pittsburgh. There's Pittsburgh. 50 megatons. We'll do an air burst. Now, what I find interesting is we want to destroy Pittsburgh because Pittsburgh is evil and we're Ohio. Wait a minute, what are we also destroying here? Are we starting to destroy what it is we're trying to protect? The other reality in nuclear war is nobody knows how many of these bombs would be dropped. So if this is the effect of one atomic explosion, just to be safe, let's drop a few more on Pittsburgh, are you going to end up destroying what it is you're trying to save. And at some point, it can't be rational. I can't imagine. So if we go back to the proposition here that maybe this is, strangely enough, a ray of hope. And what we've done here is to try to prevent nuclear war by deterring it. Unfortunately, we're back in the dark clouds. Deterrence is based on a threat to do what you are hoping to avoid. So basically, we're back to this reciprocal arrangement. One side says to the other, if you escalate to the extreme, we will do the same thing. The message being, don't escalate. Whatever you do to us, we will do back to you. In fact, American nuclear policy through the 60s, 70s, and even into the 80s was termed mutual assured destruction. Mutual, both sides would be destroyed. Are you sure? Yeah, it's assured. And destruction, these are the weapons. So it's based on a threat. You do to me, I will do back to you even worse. So don't do it. The problem is the threat to retaliate has to be credible. And a credible threat requires two things: the willingness to retaliate and the ability to retaliate. We're right back where we started. And the time has come where, and again, this is my ray of hope, it's maybe no longer rational to try to solve our problems by resorting to war. It's not a whole lot that we can hang our hat on, but it's something. However, the first quote was by Albert Einstein. The second quote, also by Einstein. So the goal is, hopefully, for world leaders to begin to understand exactly what could happen as a way of trying to make sure that it doesn't. This is a video. I'm not going to show you the whole thing, but it sort of encapsulates some of the things I've been talking about here. And let's see if this works.
Major funding for war and peace in the nuclear age was provided by the Annenberg CPB project. Additional funding was provided by the Chubb Group of insurance companies for over 100 years, providing business and personal insurance worldwide through independent agents and brokers, and by the W. Walton Jones Foundation, the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, public television stations, and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
In the beginning, there was one atom bomb. It was 1945.
Having found the atomic bomb, we have used it. It is an awful responsibility which has come to us. We thank God that it has come to us, instead of to our enemies.
By 1952, the Americans had 1,000 nuclear weapons. The Soviets, about 100.
Now, in any combat where these things can be used on strictly military targets and for strictly military purposes, I see no reason that they shouldn't be used just exactly as you'd use a bullet or anything else.
8 years later, the superpower arsenal exceeded 20,000.
It shall be the policy of this nation regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response from the Soviet Union.
During the Cuban Missile Crisis, the superpowers had more than 30,000 nuclear weapons.
The Chinese Communist nuclear detonation is a reflection of policies which do not serve the cause of peace. But there is no reason to fear that it will lead to immediate dangers of war.
By the end of the 1960s, England, France, and China had acquired nuclear weapons.
Two nuclear nations, each of which has the power to destroy humanity, have no alternative but to coexist peacefully. Because in a nuclear war, there would be no winners.
By 1974, the superpower arsenal had risen to 52,000.
The Soviet Union and the United States have accumulated thousands of nuclear weapons. Our two nations now have 5 times more missile warheads than we had just 8 years ago. But we are not 5 times more secure.
By 1980, the total was 55,000.
Today, the threat of nuclear disaster hangs over the lives of all our people. The Bible tells us there will be a time for peace, but so far this century, mankind has failed to find it.
Instead, we try to find security by staying ready for war. Radars dot our borders, and early warning satellites fill the skies. All of it because today, the United States and the Soviet Union could annihilate each other in less than an hour's time.
We have an IRBM in the system, and our confidence is high.
And so the militaries are on constant alert,
Missile warning
listening,
informed, sir. Thank you.
watching, and monitoring each other. Even after recent cuts, the superpowers have at their disposal some 50,000 nuclear weapons. These weapons are poised on the tips of intercontinental missiles underground, 28 minutes from their targets on the other side of the Earth. They ride in the holds of long and short-range bombers stationed at air bases around the world. Wherever the superpower navies cruise, nuclear weapons go with them. They prowl the depths on submarines, undetected, sometimes within minutes of impact on coastal cities. All the while, listening, watching, waiting. Ready for that day when, in spite of everything, in spite of all reason, deterrence fails.
Missile warning, this is Beale. Stand by for confidence reporting.
SSCO, no malfunction.
Missile warning, no malfunction.
Keep trying. Missile warning, this is Beale. Confidence is high. I repeat, confidence is high. Roger, we've got 32 targets in track and 10 impacting points. I want to confirm, is this an exercise? Roger, copy. This is not an exercise. I gotta go. Stand by to copy the message. Standing by.
50,000 nuclear weapons. Some 2.5 tons of TNT for every man, woman, and child on the planet. 1 megaton hydrogen bomb exploding in the air above a single city would be an unimaginable catastrophe. The intense thermonuclear flash would ignite everything it touched over a distance of 8 miles. The shockwave would explode most buildings. Raging superheated winds of hurricane force would whip fire and debris through the air. No one knows how many such bombs would be detonated in a nuclear war, or if a war could be kept limited once it began. Our two countries rely on the terror of nuclear war to help us keep the peace. We've come to this precarious condition over the last 50 years of the nuclear age. This was the beginning.
So I hope you get a sense of some of the issues here. And these next, no, I don't want to do that. Here, let's go. These next quotes, to me, simultaneously represent both the fear of global destruction and the ray of hope that maybe world leaders will make a conscious decision not to take that risk. I find it fascinating that Henry Adams, as early as 1862, could project that at some point we would have the power to blow up the world. What potential goal could be worth it? How does this even rationally fit into any cost-benefit analysis? Winston Churchill, 1948, talking about the ability of mankind to unfailingly accomplish its own extermination. What could be worth it? Robert Lifton quoted in the book in 1986, The Making of the Atomic Bomb, such a weapon has the power to make everything into nothing, literally. Again, what could possibly be worth this? And maybe that's our ray of hope. Hopefully that leaders today are rational enough, and I know the jury is still out on that one, rational enough not to engage in a reciprocal push to the extreme that could absolutely destroy whatever it is they're trying to achieve. I'm thinking, though, that I find it ironic that a little boy and his stuffed tiger probably figured this out before any of our world leaders. I know, I do too. So in this frame here, Calvin is the fearless American defender of liberty and democracy. That's certainly something worth fighting for, isn't it? And of course, Hobbes is the loathsome, godless communist oppressor. It's certainly worth destroying that, isn't it? So this matches Morgenthau's fifth characteristic of total war, a war of total stakes. They're not just messing around here. They're fighting for something they believe is significantly important. Because they're fighting for something that important, they're going to use everything they have. Dart guns. That's total mechanization. That's Morgenthau's fifth point. I don't see anybody else involved, so this is the war of the total population, by the total population, against the other's population. And whoever gets hit with a dart loses and is dead, and the other side wins. Kind of a stupid game, isn't it? And hopefully, leaders around the world today understand that and realize that even if not from an ethical or moral perspective, they look at this situation in a rational way to a point where there's no way that they're going to achieve their goals by engaging in these kinds of activities. That is the ray of hope. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Any questions? Yes, sir. Well, again, as I said at the beginning, I don't necessarily have an answer to that question, and clearly in one sense, war is not obsolete. But perhaps, and again, a ray of hope, there's a reason that some of these conflicts maybe haven't escalated to a point where they might have. I know Putin has threatened or hinted at using nuclear weapons, but he hasn't. And while the war in Ukraine has been horrific and much longer than anyone anticipated and worse, and who knows what the ultimate results are going to be, and maybe this isn't much of a ray of hope. It isn't as bad as it might have been. Of course, we're still not at the end of it yet. But clearly nations still believe that it is in their best interest to do this kind of thing. Let's just be careful. It would be, yeah. Anything else? Yes, sir. Yes, but again, it still has to be tempered with what is it we hope to achieve and what could be the potential cost. Unfortunately, throughout history, you may not know what the costs are going to be until after the fact. If you ask me, do I think World War II was eminently necessary and justified in that sense, I believe that it was. If you ask me if American involvement in Vietnam was justified, given that the war went on for almost 20 years, led to over 60,000 American dead, and at the end of all that, Vietnam became communist anyway, I would say no, it wasn't worth it. But it all has to factor into a country's value systems. And the one thing I would say is, and the United States sometimes has a problem with this, we sometimes tend to impose our value systems onto other countries and other societies, where we think that their value system is the same as ours. Oh, they wouldn't possibly risk destroying everything. I think you run into trouble. But, you know, again, your question to me is more of an individual question, and I can give you an individual answer. There is no formula as to what wars are worth it and what wars aren't. If you ask my own opinion, yes, World War II was worth it. Vietnam wasn't. And I think any use of nuclear weapons, once you cross that threshold, I can't imagine what would be worth it. I think there has to be, it comes down to a delicate balance. How do you protect yourself and defend yourself without provoking the other side? If you defend yourself too little, you might invite an attack or some kind of negative reaction against you, which obviously you were hoping to avoid. And if you're too aggressive, instead of inviting the attack, you might provoke the attack, which either way, it gets us to a point where you don't want to get to. So I think that whole proposition of how do you prepare to defend yourself without inviting attack or provoking an attack, that's a delicate balance. And so much of it is psychological. Does the other side perceive that you're acting in an overly aggressive way? Do they perceive that you're not acting in as much of a defensive stance as you should? Again, you don't want to provoke what you're trying to avoid, but you also don't want to invite it either. And that's a delicate, I mean, that's extraordinarily delicate, especially when you have to work with other countries who have their own security interest and their own agenda. That's extraordinarily difficult. But I think if more people are on kind of a common understanding that at some level, it could become a stupid game because you end up destroying what you're trying to save. Not at all. I think when you look at technology, physics, if one country is doing something, you can rest assured the other country is too. Now, they may not be at exactly the same level at the same pace, but I don't think any country in the world looks at another country and goes, oh my God, they're doing that? Everybody knows. There is no monopoly on scientific knowledge in one country or another. And I think that was a mistake the United States made in the early stages of the Cold War, thinking, well, the Soviets will never catch up. Predictions were they were anywhere from 20 to 30 years behind us. Well, we exploded our first atomic bomb in 1945. They exploded theirs in 49. We exploded our first hydrogen bomb in 1952. They exploded theirs in 1954. So any kind of arrogance that we're so far ahead, I don't think is at all realistic. I don't think we're the only ones that impose our values. I think throughout history we've tended to do it a little less by force, but it's still a level of arrogance and imposition that, oh, they're going to think the same way we did. For example, when we had our policy of mutual assured destruction, Americans had calculated what that level of destruction would be that they don't want to cross. We assumed that the Soviets had the same calculation. Well, I would pose this question. It is estimated that the Soviet Union lost between 20 and 40 million killed in World War II. Would the United States have dropped out of World War II knowing that we could have suffered the same casualties? So what we would have considered to be, oh my God, it just isn't worth it. The Soviets considered it was worth it. So I think we run into problems when we try to do that. And I'm not sure I have a good answer for what would prevent that, other than, and this is human nature as well at the individual level, we as a country, we as people tend to feel more comfortable with others that are more similar to us than different. So whether it's wishful thinking or by force imposing our value system as sort of a universal model, that can be dangerous. I don't know that there's a particular answer to it, because we do have an interest in having the world be a certain way. Now, how much you want to micromanage that is, every administration is different. But I don't know. I don't have a good answer for you. I wish I did. I wish we could snap our fingers and we would all get there. The problem is, if a country is on the road to being able to neutralize these kinds of weapons, it's going to take time. The other countries are going to find out, because chances are we'd be working on the same thing. So the question then becomes, and the pressure is, do I act in advance of them getting that capability? In other words, if we wait until another country has the capability of neutralizing these weapons, the incentive to use our weapons before they get to that point goes up, which is a very dangerous kind of thing. And that was always the argument during the 1960s and 70s. Should the United States be working on a missile defense system? Well, would you want to entice the Soviets to attack before our missile defense system became operative? Because I think they would feel the pressure that all that money, all that time, effort in making those weapons would soon be obsolete. We might use them sooner rather than later. So that's the danger with that. Again, if you could snap your fingers and have the technology just be in place instantly, oh, I'd go for that right away. But it's, usually there's a 30-year lead time from the planning, the development, the building, the deployment of these weapons. And if one side thinks the other is going to get to that point, the incentive to use their weapons first goes up, which is what we don't want. I think in the case of, well, I wish it wasn't, but in the case of some of these conflicts that just seem to go on further than we would have anticipated, when the Russians first attacked Ukraine, even if you were like on the side of Ukraine, you had to figure it was going to be over in 2 weeks. Well, I'm glad it isn't, except the death and the destruction has continued. And I think, again, it takes us back to that first reciprocal action. One side, in this case Russia, is imposing its will on Ukraine, and Ukraine is continuing to resist. So as long as that initial impetus for the war continues, it's going to escalate. And whether it escalates in terms of destruction, it's certainly escalating in terms of its duration. And then, of course, the longer it goes, the more destructive it becomes. But I wish that wasn't the case, but that's what Clausewitz had discovered in his experiences in war, in the Napoleonic Wars. As long as one side was continuing to resist, the other side would keep pushing, which meant the other side would have to push back, and it becomes that kind of escalatory. And of course, the emotions kick in the longer it goes, the angrier you get because you didn't achieve your goals right from the start. Good question, though. Well, I think hopefully they would realize that the world has become much more interdependent. Whether you're looking at climate issues or even economic issues, which at some point are still kind of selfish, that I'm going to use this analogy. There were times during the history of organized crime in the United States where the various competing families decided to stop killing each other because it was bad for business. Well, the more that countries can realize that ultimately having hegemony is not necessarily good for business, we're in the same boat. And again, a lot of you guys, you're asking great questions. I don't have definitive answers because, as I said at the very beginning, the answer to the question, is war obsolete? In many respects, no. I mean, we're witnessing it every day. But just looking for that ray of hope, that there is, I think, incentives for mutual cooperation, interdependence. And we've seen examples of it. We really have. I hate to use this analogy, but throughout history, Russia and China really have hated each other, and yet they have found some common ground. It's not necessarily conducive to American security, but there is an example of avowed enemies finding some common ground. I think it was, there's a lot of layers to that answer. I think it was to continue to uphold our pledge to protect Ukraine, so there is always that political side of things. And I think that at some point the calculations come in, how much is Putin willing to lose by having this war goes on? Because I can tell you for a fact, it did not go as he anticipated. Just like experiences in Vietnam, just like Soviet experiences in Afghanistan. It was a kind of classic, wait, what? So I think anything that adds to the cost for Russia and Putin is good unless Putin begins to calculate, well, all is lost, I might as well go down with the ship. But then again, I don't know that there are too many leaders in the world that would deliberately put themselves in a position to lose everything they want to be in charge of. It's a delicate balance. And not being privy to those inner discussions, I can only look at it from afar. But it's a game. One of the most important books I read in grad school about all this was titled "The Games That Nations Play." It's a game. It's a deadly game. It's a serious game. But there's bluff, there's counter bluff, there's posturing, it's happening at an uncountable number of levels simultaneously. It's extraordinarily difficult. Well, I think you have a whole range of possibilities, from economic sanctions, political pressure. You know, however we look at it, international relations is still a kind of public relations game as well. Nations do not want to be isolated diplomatically, politically, culturally, economically. So I think there's a whole bag of tools that nations can use to impose and get what they want. Every nation wants what it wants. Every nation has their own agenda. And the question that I was trying to get at tonight is, at what point does using force, rather than help your agenda, destroy your agenda? I wish the answer was clear before we would get into it. I mean, Calvin and Hobbes didn't quite think this through until it was too late. Hopefully we avoid that. Well, I do think that over history, authoritarian leaders have used the fear of an outside threat as a method of internal political control. The people of a particular country under authoritarian rule may not like it, but those people over there. So authoritarians have used that fear of an outside threat to get into and stay into power. The democracies, and again, this is where some of that arrogance comes in, well, if government is based on the will of the people won't necessarily support a war like this. I could give you plenty of examples where democracies fought other democracies. And the irony is, we love democracy so much, it's such a wonderful system, that we will go to war against anybody who isn't democratic. And yet, most democracies would probably call themselves peaceful. You know, and in the United States, that's happened many times. But again, that factors into their agenda, their sense of identity, what they think is important. And unfortunately, there are a lot of ironies in all this.